Could you explain to us that what is making monster? How is it connected to dehumanization?
Yeah,
And particularly, you use Freud, the idea of uncanny psychology, and you
yeah,
also use a German philosopher and also a roboticist.
yeah.
You did a wonderful job. Could you explain for our audience
Okay, yeah.
how is
So
it?
as you've indicated, this has a
Mhm,
lot of moving parts, but
mhm,
I'm going to try and set out really, really
mhm,
clearly and simply. Um, so in my 2011 book, I said when we dehumanize others, we treat them as having the essence of a subhuman animal.
mhm,
Now, there are two powerful criticisms of that account, good criticisms. One of them we find in a lot of the literature. I call it the problem of humanity. And the fact is that if we actually look at examples of dehumanization, historical examples, what we find is that dehumanizers both refer to those who they dehumanize as subhuman and also refer to them as human. They treat them as subhuman animals and also they treat them in ways that are only appropriate to the treatment of human beings. So, for instance, it's very common in, say, genocides to humiliate people before killing them. We found that in the Holocaust. We found it in Rwanda. Mass rapes in Rwanda were specifically intended for humiliation. Um, it's very common. But you don't humiliate cockroaches, right? It doesn't make any sense. You don't humiliate rats. The idea of humiliation only applies to human beings. And this has led some people to be skeptical of, of dehumanization, the reality of dehumanization. Now, very often it's quite explicit. Sometimes in the very same sentence, a group of people will be described as subhuman and as human, right? The other problem I call the problem of monstrosity. As far as I know, I'm the only one who has criticized my own work along these lines. That my original conception that when we dehumanize others, we treat them simply as subhuman animals, doesn't explain the idea that humanized people are monsters and demons, which is very common in the worst, most destructive forms of dehumanization. So we need an explanation of both those things. These are two challenges. I took them seriously and I modified my views. So here's what I think now. Um, I mentioned earlier that um, that we defer to the experts, right? So they're people who we place in positions of authority as scientists or religious leaders, and nowadays even celebrities and radio personalities and so on. And we allow them to define reality for us, and that's often a sound thing to do because they're experts. I mean, you go to a doctor when you're ill because they know more than you do. And they can tell you things that you don't know about what's going on in your own body. And often, I said, these people lead us astray by telling us that some group of people are really less than human, they're really subhuman. And we accept that. But there's something about human nature that makes it impossible to accept that completely. And that's what I need to talk about now. So, we are what biologists call an ultra social species. We're highly, highly social, cooperative, trusting of one another. We could not exist, without these human groups with tremendous solidarity. Place any of us in the Canadian wilderness right now in the snow. We're not going to live very long, right?
mhm,
We
mhm,
need each
mhm,
other. And we
mhm,
need all the fruits of human cooperation, the technologies, the houses that we live in, the clothes that we wear. and so on. And this has been going on for a very, very long time. There was a recent article, I think last week, looking at the distribution of ostrich shell beads in Africa in prehistory, and showing that there are immense trade networks spanning this whole vast continent. People were cooperating and trading 50,000 years ago, at least. Now, one thing about being highly social is that we're very sensitive to the humanness of others, particularly the sight of a human face. So you and I, we're looking into one another's eyes right now. We can't help responding to one another as human beings. That's just how we're built. There's a lot of very interesting neurological evidence that we process human faces in a unique way. Our brains do something very special. We see human faces differently than we see any other kind of thing. And that, by the way, has the effect of inhibiting aggression. Because if you're highly social, you cannot be at each other's throats. You know, the sight of a human face, that's why it's very difficult for people to kill one another up close. And when they do, it's traumatic for the killer. It haunts them for a lifetime for most people, because those inhibitions just went sight of a pair of human eyes, bang, they're there. You know, it's interesting that blindfolds are often used for executions. I think it's no accident. You know, when the Islamic State kills someone publicly, they put something over their head and kill from behind. They cut the throat from behind. And firing squads, there's blindfolding, concealing the eyes. Okay, so even though we accept what the experts tell us, that, you know, the Rohingya or the Jews or the Native Americans are not really human beings, in our encounters with them, we can't help seeing them as human. That's beyond our control. Now that sets up something which is, in fact, extremely dangerous and extremely toxic. And that is that we see the other, the dehumanized other, as human and subhuman at once. Now you might say, well, this is irrational. Yeah, human beings are irrational. That's a typical philosopher response. That couldn't be. Logic doesn't work that way. Yeah, right. It's such a silly response. Right. So why is that so dangerous? Well, here we have to go to a literature that I've traced back to about 1906. I'm going to just briefly run through some of the points. It starts with a man named Ernst Jentsch, a German psychiatrist who published a paper in 1906 called The Psychology of the English translation is uncanny. The German word is unheimlich. Unheimlich means disturbing, creepy, maybe at the extreme horrifying. So what he was trying to do is figure out what exactly it is to experience something in this kind of way. And that's different from being frightened, right? So one of his examples was figures in a wax museum. That's very common. People like see these things as creepy, it's disturbing. Well, why? And Jentsch basically says it's because we see them at the same time. We respond to them as human and not human, as animate and inanimate. So if they're well done, they look like, you know, it's like there's the guy. Say there's a sculpture, wax sculpture of George Bush. Well, there's the guy standing there, but then it's not quite. It's a little bit off. It's waxy and dead looking in the eyes. And what Jentsch says is, as long as our minds are kind of torn in these two directions at once, we can't settle on one or another interpretation. We experience the figure as unheimlich, uncanny, disturbing, creepy. Another example he uses, I think it's a very interesting one, is human corpses. So if you're not accustomed to dealing with corpses, you look at you know, your father, your dead father, and your response is, there's dad lying there. But no, there's no breathing, and the body is cold, and it's a slab of meat. Um, your mind, again, is pulled in two directions at once: dead flesh and a human being. And it gives that disturbing quality. All right, so that was Jentzsch's paper. And you can see right away, he's kind of on the same territory as I am on when I say that when we dehumanize others, we think of them as human and subhuman at the same time, right? So that should elicit this creepiness, disturbing characteristic. Now let's move ahead to 1966, a very famous book by a woman named Mary Douglas, an anthropologist. It's a confusing book too. I don't think she was a great writer, but she was very brilliant. And she argued, she's trying to give a theory of uncleanliness. And she doesn't mean particularly uncleanliness in terms of hygiene. She means what was sometimes called ritual uncleanliness. So for instance, in Judaism and Islam, by the way, certain foods or food combinations are unclean. And she gave a very influential analysis of the rules, saying all the foods that are unclean violate categories. So what's the story there? The story is that human cultures have these frameworks of what's natural. There are certain kinds of things, and they're arranged in certain relations, they're categories. But whenever you divide up nature in that way, there are things that don't fit. They seem to violate these categories. So in her discussion of the kosher dietary rules, Jews can't eat shrimp. Well, why is that? Because they're like fish. They live in the sea, but they look like insects. So they seem to violate these categories, right? And so they're unclean and disturbing. And she goes through all of these haram foodstuffs and analyzes them that way. So things that don't fit in are seen as unnatural, disturbing, and immensely powerful, by the way. They need to be handled carefully, labeled, confined, destroyed. Okay. A few years later, Masahiro Mori, a Japanese roboticist, publishes a paper which the title is translated as The Uncanny Valley. Or you could translate it The Valley of Uncanniness, but uncanny, the word translated as uncanny in Japanese is bukimi, which is equally translatable as creepy, so the valley of creepiness. And really, this was a prediction. It's a very short paper, extremely influential. And it was basically a rediscovery and modernization of what Jentzsch said back in 1906. He doesn't acknowledge Jentzsch. I don't know if you read it. But what Mori predicted was as we make robots that are more and more human looking, we'll become more and more comfortable with them until they're almost indistinguishable from real human beings, but not quite. And when that happens, we'll experience them as bukimi, as disturbing. And that's called the uncanny valley, particularly when they move, which is really interesting because Jentzsch also talked about movements as enhancing this effect. He also said this about artificial limbs, prosthetic limbs. In fact, he argued that we shouldn't make artificial hands. I'm bringing my hand into the picture. We shouldn't try to make them realistic looking because they will repel people. We should make them clearly artificial. Okay. So, we've got a picture building here. There's one final bit, which is a crucial bit. This is a philosopher named Noel Carroll, who wrote a wonderful book called The Philosophy of Horror. He's interested in horror fiction. He does philosophy of art, he does aesthetics, and he asks a bunch of questions about horror fiction, like why do we enjoy horror? And what makes a monster in horror fiction? And that's what I want to focus on here. The other question is also important, just by the way, from my views, although I haven't written on it yet. So what Jensch says is that, sorry, what Carroll says, and he's drawing on Douglas, is that monsters in horror fiction have to have two characteristics. They have to be physically dangerous. They want to hurt you, right? They want to kill you or eat your brain or whatever. Nice monsters aren't monsters. But they also have to be what he calls cognitively threatening, and I call metaphysically threatening. That is, they have to not fit into the categories of the natural, and they're usually combinations of incompatible things. So one of his examples, and one of my favorite examples, are zombies in zombie movies, the genre of horror movies that feature zombies. Well, what makes zombies so scary? It's not their physical powers usually, because they're just barely managing to walk around. What makes them terrifying is that they're both alive and dead at the same time. They're rotting corpses that walk around and eat things. So it's that combination of contradictories which sort of amplifies their perceived dangerousness. Or werewolves that are wolves and human beings at the same time. You can go right through the horror canon and you find this again and again and again and again. And notice now we have the word horror, right? That's like the extreme of creepiness plus physical dangerousness, right? So now let's take this model and do something with it that he never does. Let's apply it to the behavior of real human beings, not fictional monsters, who regard other human beings as monstrous or demonic. And it fits the formula perfectly. So first of all, groups that are dehumanized are, before they're dehumanized, almost always seen as physically threatening. They're terrorists, they're murderers, they're rapists. We see it again and again. We saw it with the Rohingya, we saw it with the Jews, we saw it with the Native Americans. Just every case, right? We have to protect ourselves from these people. Paradoxically, by the way, it's typically the most vulnerable people in a population that are seen as so dangerous. So we have the element of physical threat.
Mm-hmm.
To that is added seeing them as simultaneously human, because we can't help it,
Mm-hmm.
and subhuman, because the propagandists tell us that.
Mm-hmm.
Those two things in combination then turns them into monsters and makes them seem much more frightening than would otherwise be the case. If they were only subhuman animals,
Mm-hmm.
it would not be so bad. But if they're monsters, if they're demons, I mean, there's no restraint, is there?
Mm-hmm.
You don't show pity to a demon.
Mm-hmm.
You don't show compassion to a monster.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's that, paradoxically, it's the failure to see others as simply less than human animals, which
Mm-hmm.
leads to the worst atrocities that
Mm-hmm.
humans commit.
Mm-hmm.
And they make them into monsters.
So what you started with, and and this is something very important that we want our audience, and particularly our students, to understand it very well, is that dehumanization is our ability, and you talk about the idea, the psychology of ambivalence,
Yeah.
that together, at the simultaneously, we hold somebody, oh, they're human, but
Mhm.
they're not human.
Yes. So that
Together.
solves the two problems. It also solves the problem of humanity. Why do dehumanizers flip between describing the other as human and
Mhm.
describing them as subhuman?
Mhm.
It's because of these two representations.
Mhm.
At any given time, only one can be in the forefront of consciousness. So we get
Mhm.
flip,
Mhm.
flip, 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 flip.
Yeah, and you use Freudian psychology, that when Freud
Yeah.
talked about the origin of OCD, that
Yes.
we, and I will contextualize it for our students in Bangladesh, is that, and obviously particularly in rural
Mhm.
context, is that a lot of the dehumanization of the girls is that um, in so many contexts that they're just like us, but they're not
But
just
they're
like
not
us.
like us. Yeah.
They're not like us.
Yeah.
And I find this an analytic, this framework so useful. And I'm also going to use it for my own research, disinformation
Wonderful.
research. Yeah, because I want to understand that how is it possible that what we're seeing right now in Canada, anybody who is
Mm.
familiar of that, in less than a week, about 400,000 people have gathered. And because of my research, I'm watching it very closely.
Yeah.
Is that about 400,000 people got together and they're saying no vaccine mandate, but that started with vaccine mandate, but now they have gone to Ottawa. They want to overthrow government. And what is scary, David, is that
Mm.
they're saying, and CBC has published article on it, it's on video, that they want their own version of January 6th.
Right.
Yeah. But
They're
then,
explicit about this.
yeah, yeah.
Gosh.
The explicit to the extent that I want, because they have gone there with truck. They're saying that I want the truckers to just plow through this 6-inch building and
Wow.
just do it. But then, if you look at who are speaking, what's unmistakably majority, I haven't found so far one, are white, able-bodied, cisgendered
Yeah.
men.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if you look at their political agenda, if you look at their rhetoric and the kind of discourse they're saying, take Canada back.
Right.
Take back
Mm.
Canada. Now,
Yeah.
does it sound familiar? Make
Yeah.
America great
Sounds very
again?
familiar. Mhm.
In Brexit, take
Mm.
back control?
Yeah.
And I was thinking, what kind of dehumanization is happening here? And to me, as somebody who is passionately researching disinformation, misinformation, and propaganda, and understanding its intimate connection to dehumanization,
Yeah.
there are ample evidence in history, but it's happening now.
Yeah. It
It's
is.
happening
Yeah.
now,
Yeah.
right
In various
now.
places in the world. Yeah.
Yeah, it's happening right now. So that tells me, let's say, I mean, and this is for our audience in Bangladesh. I mean, use your imagination, use your creativity to understand it, that when anybody presents a position that does not assign, that does not
Hmm.
sit well with me, question is that what is it their political, cultural, religious, gender, any position that makes me feel that, there was a famous incident, not obviously, it's a very heartbreaking incident, is that a father was sitting somewhere, and I'm learning this from you, David, and thank you very much, to be able to speak the most despicable things calmly. It's
Mm.
important. It's important. uh, I experienced a lot of empathic distress from there as well. Your interview with Paul Bloom and Bloom's book of Against Empathy. What I find empathy, Bloom's work, is that it's the same chemical that makes us bond tremendously with our children, with our offspring. The same mindset
Hmm.
makes us capable of doing the most despicable kind of
Yeah.
crime.
Yeah.
And honestly, David, I couldn't express in words that how much it humbles me. When somebody says that, I want we want our own version of January 6th. I thank you. It helps me that, I want to understand why. Like, why?
Yeah.
Not to
Right.
demonize them. Why?
Yeah. Why? Well, we've got a lot of work to do.
Yeah, yeah. Towards the end, obviously, you have been doing this for how many decades? You have been at
It's
it,
about 15
dehumanization.
years I've been on this topic.
Oh,
Yeah.
15 years on it.
Mhm.